It's, well, I think for a lot of cradle Orthodox, it's not an easy question to answer, but I do remember, even even when I was a teenager, thinking that I need to start taking this seriously. But it didn't really get much farther than the thinking that it should get serious until college, when being a student of Russian literature in University of California, Berkeley, I was immediately faced with a whole bunch of worldviews that were contrary and definitely contrary to my own, but seemed in some ways valid. Maybe not for me, but certainly for the people that held them. And I think a lot of people go through some sort of crisis of identity in college. But for me, it wasn't, I think, the usual one, maybe, because being of Russian extraction, being Orthodox was always tied in very much with being Russian throughout my life. I didn't even speak English until I was 5, by the way. So this is, being Russian was always, even before being Orthodox. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was. And that's the case for a lot of people who come from that part of the world. So I had to decide at some point when I got to college, because I was suddenly faced with the reality that the Holy Russia that I was taught about was not real. It was a fantasy. So I had to decide, how important is that fantasy to me, and how am I going to define myself as somebody who believes in effectively a historical fantasy that was given to me by my grandparents. Is it sustainable, and is it that important? And ultimately, I decided that it was more important for me to be Orthodox first and Russian second. And after that, that's when I really started to form myself intellectually and spiritually, I think, in terms of identity, and also just in terms of an active engagement with the spiritual life. Because I was faced with people who thought it was silly, who thought it was stupid, and thought it was retrograde. So yeah, from then on, I just decided that that's what I was going to do. I was going to be Orthodox. And strangely enough, the Russian part didn't fall away. It just took its proper place. So I do think of myself as a Russian American, not just as an American. And certainly my Orthodoxy is Russian flavored, and much of what I do creatively and professionally is Russian flavored. But it's always first and foremost Orthodox. Well, I'm not a full-time novelist, not in the professional sense. Full-time meaning it supports my life financially. That's not the case. It's something that will never be the case because I'm a deacon, so I can't be full-time anything other than deacon. Not in the way that I think of myself. I would like eventually to get to the point where my writing is more of a financial support, so that I can actually, it's strange, but it's so that I can spend more time serving. Because I think that this profession, it's conducive to a spiritual life, and actually it's helpful to, it's the kind of thing that I think a deacon or a priest might do professionally and still be a halfway decent cleric. But in terms of how did I get into this more regularly and think of approach this in a more professional way, it's a pretty recent development. It's for a while I went the traditional route. I've been writing for ages. So my first novel that came out of almost 2 years ago now, I wrote it over the course of 7 years, and it was a kind of response to actually a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. This was in 2007, and when I came back, I started to rewrite. It was the first time I had any sort of sustained writing practice. So every day I opened my Moleskine journal in the Holy Land and wrote a little bit. And I had more than 100 pages of notes when I got back. And I wanted to transcribe them so that I would have a more lasting record of what I had gone through, because I knew that I'd forget a lot of it very quickly. But I found that I couldn't do it. I couldn't rewrite it. It felt wrong somehow. It felt unnatural to just type out the notes that I had written. I don't know why. And I started to think, I want to retell the story of my pilgrimage in a mythic mode. It feels natural to me. It feels like this would be a way for me to internalize the trip, and it would be a way to make sense of it. But it went off the rails completely. It started to do its own thing. So it stopped being a retelling of the pilgrimage and it started to be something different. It started to be a fairy tale of its own. So I did that for a long time, 7 years, and then I went the traditional route and I found an agent in New York who liked it and tried to shop it around to the publishers. But he never got any interest in it, and as I found out later, he wasn't exactly even though he worked for a major agency, he had some personal issues, I guess. He was eventually pushed out of the agency and forced to resign on ethics violations. So I got very lucky. As it turned out, I did get very lucky because I found out that right now the publishing business is in a kind of a mess. There's a big revolution going on in terms of independent publishing, and because of the rise of Amazon as the major producer and a marketplace for books. So I found out from some very successful people in the book publishing business that financially, if you can reach your niche, it makes a lot more sense to be independent because you have a lot more control over the process, and you can publish as fast or as slow as you like. You don't have to wait the requisite 1 year between the signing of a contract and the publishing of your book, which would have happened if I had signed with a major publisher. It also meant, and this is a major issue for Christians now, especially in fantasy, which I write, there's a real move right now to embrace a very simplistic and very strange kind of diversity in fantasy, where it's less about the story and it's more about the ideology. So my story would have been carved up into mincemeat. I would have lost a lot of the creative control. Ultimately, I suppose I could have said yes or no to the editorial changes, but that might have depended whether or not that might have determined whether or not I published. So this way, I can write the story that I think is right, while I still have the same access to the professionals that make my work up to the same level as the books that are published by main publishers, because I can find the same editors that work on big books. I can find cover designers that have worked with Stephen King, for example. There's a lot more access to that sort of thing right now in the world because of the internet, because of Amazon, because of other things. So that happened about 2 years ago. I was in Belarus with my family for 6 months, trying out the living in Eastern Europe thing. Living in former Soviet bloc countries that still might be a Soviet bloc country, it just doesn't know yet. Anyway, that's a whole different story. This was a year after I'd signed with my agent. He had even stopped answering my emails, and I realized that I was just doing everything wrong. And I started to read some authors who were in the independent space, and I thought, this is what I want to do. Not merely to publish my own books, but because I know that there are writers out there who, Orthodox writers, or Christian writers in general, who are interested in telling a story that is not going to be published now. So I went that way, and since then I've been studying both the craft and the business of it, and slowly but surely I've been selling my own books and selling the books of a few other authors who have similar interests and similar passion as I do for storytelling in an Orthodox mode.